Along the Mississippi River Delta in Louisiana, there is a document that has confused historians for more than 100 years. It is a property deed filed in the fall of 1852 that records something that should have been impossible under every law of the South before the Civil War. A man named Moses, who had been born into slavery on Plantation, became the legal owner of that very same plantation just 8 months after his master died. But the story does not stop there. In a turn of events that broke all social rules of that time, Moses married his former master's widow, a white woman from a well-known Creole family, just 40 days after the funeral. The parish clerk who wrote down their marriage license wrote a note on the side of the paper saying, "God have mercy on us all." Within the first year of Moses gaining his freedom, 6 people who questioned his fast rise to power died under strange circumstances that the police refused to look into deeply. His former master, Henry Bosson, was found dead with a hunting rifle across his lap. Yet, details in the sealed coroner's report did not match the official decision that it was suicide. The 2 white overseers who challenged Moses's power both died within months of each other. A priest who tried to step in was killed in what officials called a riding accident. By 1853, Moses Beauchamp, the name he took after marrying the widow, controlled one of the richest estates in Ascension Parish. The question that scared everyone who knew the story was simple but terrifying. How many people had died to make this impossible change happen? Before we go on with the story of Moses and the violent path that led from slave quarters to plantation master, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel if you are interested in the darkest parts of American history, and leave a comment telling me what state or city you are listening from. This is a story that was hidden on purpose for many years, and your comments help bring these forgotten truths to light. The events I am about to share with you have been put together from parish records, personal letters, account books, and words spoken during a closed investigation that few people know ever happened. What happened at Plantation challenges everything we think we know about power, loyalty, and staying alive in the Old South. Plantation stood on a curve of the Mississippi River in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, where the dirt was black and rich enough to grow sugarcane that sold for very high prices in New Orleans. The land stretched across nearly 800 acres, its edges marked by old oak trees covered in Spanish moss that seemed to soak up the heavy Louisiana air. The main house rose 3 stories high, built in the French colonial style with wide porches wrapping around each floor, tall windows that opened to catch the river breeze, and columns that had survived hurricanes for 3 generations. Henry Beauchamp had received Bellerive from his father in 1838, along with 63 enslaved people, a sugar mill that processed cane from nearby farms, and debts that would have ruined a weaker man. But Henry was not a weak man. He was ambitious, a planner, and had a special kind of smarts that saw chances where others saw only problems. By 1850, he had grown his property to include 92 slaves, paid off his father's debts, and made himself one of the top planters in the area. His success came partly from trying new farming ways. He was among the first in the region to use steam-powered machines for his sugar mill, but more importantly, it came from his willingness to watch and learn from the people he owned. Moses had been born on Bellerive in 1822, the son of a woman named Patience, who worked in the main house and a father whose name was never written in the estate books. From when he was a child, Moses showed qualities that both interested and worried those around him. He learned to read by watching Henry's children study with their teacher, memorizing lessons through the parlor window. He taught himself carpentry by watching the plantation's workers, then became better than them before his 15th birthday. He understood how to rotate crops, weather patterns, and the money side of sugar production better than many overseers. Most amazingly, he had an ability to read people, to understand their fears, desires, and weak spots with an accuracy that seemed almost unnatural. Henry recognized Moses's intelligence early and made a choice that most planters would have thought was dangerous. He gave Moses responsibility, first as a driver watching over field workers, then as a mill operator, and eventually as his personal assistant in managing the estate's business matters. Henry kept Moses close, relied on his opinion, and trusted him with information that other slaves never saw. It was a deal that helped both men. Henry's profits grew a lot under Moses's good management, while Moses gained knowledge and influence that was impossible for someone in his position. But there was a difficult part to their relationship that outsiders could not fully see. Henry's wife Celeste had arrived at Belarev in 1008, 145, the 19th year, old daughter of a fading Creole family in New Orleans. Her father had built up gambling debts that threatened to ruin the family's good name, and marrying her to the wealthy Henry Bosham, who was 15 years older than her, had been a planned solution. Celeste brought beauty, class, and social connections to Belarev. She brought no love for her husband. The plantation's social structure in 1008, 152 Louisiana was strictly set by law and custom, yet within that strict structure existed many small deals of power. The white overseers, men like Tobias Greenleaf and his brother Samuel, officially held power over all enslaved workers. But in real life, Moses held more influence. He controlled access to Henry, managed work assignments, and kept the account books that tracked every part of the plantation's work. The Greenleaf brothers hated this arrangement deeply, but Henry ignored their complaints with a practical view that made them angry. Moses made him money, and money mattered more than their hurt pride. The house staff included 12 people who worked in the main house, and they held a strange middle spot in the plantation's ladder. Louisa, who had served as Henry's nurse when he was a child and now ran the household, demanded respect from both white and black residents. Her daughter, Margaret, worked as Celeste's personal maid and held a position that gave her close knowledge of the mistress's private life. The kitchen was ruled by old Jack, a man of unknown age who had cooked for 3 generations of the family and whom everyone treated with careful respect. By the spring of 1852, Belarev appeared to be doing very well. The last harvest had been great. Henry had made good contracts with New Orleans agents, and the plantation's good name attracted buyers willing to pay high prices. The main house hosted dinner parties where the area's rich people gathered to talk about politics, cotton prices, and the growing anger between the North and South. Henry spoke strongly about states' rights and the Southern way of life, never admitting the irony that his pretty speeches defending that way of life were often based on things Moses had shared with him earlier that same day. But beneath this successful surface, tensions were building that would soon tear Belarev apart. Moses had spent 30 years watching, learning, and waiting. He understood the plantation's work better than Henry himself. He knew which nearby planters were close to losing their money, which agents in New Orleans could be tricked, which laws could be used, and which people could be influenced. He had been getting ready for something, though few guessed what or when it would happen. What no one fully understood, what perhaps even Moses himself did not fully understand until it was too late, was how completely the plantation's careful ladder would fall apart once a single important piece was removed. The entire structure of Bellerive rested on Henry Bossom's power, and that power rested on nothing more solid than tradition, law, and the group agreement that it should be that way. Remove that base, and everything built upon it would have to be decided again. The summer of 1852 would show just how weak that base truly was. The evening of June 17, 1852, began like many others at Bellerive. The day's heat had been heavy even by Louisiana standards, driving everyone to seek shade by the middle of the afternoon. Henry had spent the day looking over account books with Moses, going over numbers for the coming planting season, and talking about buying land from a neighbor whose son's gambling debts had grown too big. They had worked in Henry's study, a room on the second floor of the main house that looked over the river, its windows open to catch whatever breeze might move the thick air. Celeste had complained of a headache and stayed in her room for most of the day, helped only by Margaret. This was not unusual. Celeste often hid away from the household, claiming different sicknesses that required privacy and rest. The house staff had learned not to bother her during these times, though Louise sometimes whispered that a woman who ate so little and slept so much was inviting sickness rather than getting better from it. At 7:00, Henry sent Moses away and asked for his evening meal to be brought to his study. He had letters to write, he said, and preferred to work alone. This, too, was not unusual. Henry often did business writing in the evening, especially during the planting and harvest seasons. Louisa watched as Jack prepared a tray with cold chicken, bread, cheese, and a bottle of Henry's favorite red wine. Margaret carried the tray upstairs, knocked on the study door, heard Henry answer, and left it on the table just inside the entrance. What happened in the hours that followed has been put together from words given during the investigation, though big gaps remain in the story. At about 9:30, Tobias Greenleaf, walking around the property, noticed that a lamp still burned in Henry's study. This detail would later prove important, though at the time it seemed normal. At some point between 9:30 and 11:00, someone entered Henry's study. The door had been locked from the inside, but whoever entered had either a key or the ability to convince Henry to unlock it. At 11:45, Louisa was woken up by a sound she described as something heavy falling. She got up, lit a candle, and walked through the dark house toward Henry's study. The door stood slightly open. She was sure it had been closed when she passed by earlier, and lamplight spilled into the hallway. She pushed the door open and saw Henry Bossomp slumped in his desk chair, his head thrown back at a strange angle, his hunting rifle across his lap, and a large amount of blood on the wall behind him. Louisa's scream brought the household running. Within minutes, Moses, Celeste, Margaret, the Greenleaf brothers, and several house servants had gathered in the study. The scene looked simple. Henry had shot himself with his own rifle, the barrel placed beneath his chin. The weapon was one he kept on the wall above his desk, a long rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. Powder burns marked his chin and throat, and the bullet had gone out through the top of his skull, sticking in the ceiling beam above. Tobias Greenleaf immediately took charge of the situation, as was expected given his job as head overseer. He ordered everyone except Samuel out of the room, then sent a rider to get Dr. Matius Fentress from his home 5 miles away. He asked Louisa about who had been in the house that evening, and who might have heard anything unusual. He looked at the study for signs of a fight and found none. No overturned furniture, no sign of struggle, no broken door. Dr. Fentress arrived shortly after 1:00 in the morning. He looked at the body briefly, confirmed the clear cause of death, and guessed that Henry had been dead for about 2 to 3 hours. He noted the powder burns, the path of the bullet, and the position of the body. His first thought, written in his notes, was suicide. However, he also saw several details that worried him enough to include them in a separate, more detailed report he would later give to the parish coroner. First, Henry's hands showed no powder dust beyond what one would expect from recently touching the rifle. Second, the rifle had been found across Henry's lap, in a position that seemed awkward for someone who had just used it to shoot himself. Third, a bottle of red wine on the desk was nearly empty, but Henry was known as a light drinker who rarely had more than 2 glasses with dinner. Fourth, and most upsetting, Henry's face wore a look that Dr. Fentress struggled to describe, not the blank emptiness of sudden death, but something that looked like deep surprise mixed with what the doctor could only call recognition, as if Henry had understood something important in his final moment. The household spent the rest of that night in a state of controlled confusion. Celeste, after seeing her husband's body, had become wild with grief, screaming, pulling at her hair, and needing to be held back by both Louisa and Margaret before Dr. Fentress could give her medicine to sleep. The Greenleaf brothers stood in the study as guards, though what they were guarding against was unclear. Moses took charge of practical matters, sending riders to tell Henry's brother in Baton Rouge and the parish priest, organizing the house staff to begin getting ready for the funeral, and ensuring that nothing in the study was touched until proper officials could investigate. It was Moses's calm effectiveness during this crisis that first raised doubts in Tobias Greenleaf's mind. A man's master had just died violently, yet Moses showed no visible sadness, no break in his usual organized skill. He gave orders as if he had expected this moment, as if he had already thought through every needed step. When Greenleaf mentioned this thought to his brother later that morning, Samuel answered with a question that would repeat through later events. "How long do you think Moses has been waiting for this?" The official investigation began at sunrise. Sheriff Antoine Tiro arrived from the main town, accompanied by 2 deputies and a justice of the peace named Aldrich Budrow. They looked at the study, asked the household questions, and reviewed Dr. Fentress' early findings. By noon, they had reached their decision. Henry Bosch had taken his own life while drunk and very sad over money troubles. The decision satisfied legal needs and saved the family's good name. Suicide was scandal enough without adding hints of murder or household plots, but several people found the official decision hard to accept. Tobias Greenleaf insisted that Henry had shown no signs of sadness and had in fact been excited about coming business plans. Henry's brother, Armand, who arrived late on the 18th, pointed out that the family's money situation was actually quite healthy. something he checked by reviewing the estate's account books with Moses. Dr. Fentress privately kept his doubts about certain physical proof, and Louisa, who had served the Beauchamp family for 45 years, told anyone who would listen that Henry was not the type of man who would run from his duties through suicide, no matter what troubles he faced. Yet the inquiry was closed, the death paper was signed, and plans for Henry's burial went ahead. According to Louisiana law and Catholic custom, he should have been buried quickly, but the heat was intense, and Armand insisted on delaying the funeral until more family members could travel from New Orleans. Henry's body was placed in a sealed coffin in the Plantation's ice house, and the funeral was set for June 22nd. During those 5 days between death and burial, Bellereve Plantation existed in a strange state of waiting. All normal work continued. The fields still needed care, the mill still ran, the household still worked. But everyone understood that big change was coming. The question was what shape that change would take. Armand had legal power as Henry's closest male relative, but he lived in Baton Rouge and had his own business to manage. Celeste was Henry's widow and would get significant property, but Louisiana law limited women's control over property, and she showed no ability or desire to run a plantation. The Greenleaf brothers assumed they would step into positions of greater power, but they needed someone to sign their orders, someone with legal standing. Moses continued managing daily work as he had under Henry, and everyone accepted this arrangement because the other choice was chaos. He met with Armand to review accounts, wrote to Henry's agent in New Orleans about existing contracts, and made decisions about planting schedules that could not wait for the estate to be settled. He did all of this with the same calm skill he had always shown, and people began to forget, or perhaps they never truly believed, that his legal status had not changed. He was still enslaved. Every decision he made, every order he gave, every signature he placed on papers had no legal power whatsoever. On June 21st, the evening before Henry's funeral, Moses asked for a private meeting with Celeste. They met in the small parlor off the main hall, the same room where Henry had once done business with visiting planters. Margaret stood outside the closed door. Rules required a witness to any meeting between a white woman and an enslaved man, but she later said that she could not hear what was talked about. The meeting lasted about 45 minutes. When Moses came out, his face showed nothing. When Celeste came out 10 minutes later, she looked as if she had made a decision that both scared her and gave her relief. The funeral took place on a Wednesday afternoon with heat so heavy that several guests fainted during the service at the grave. Father Dominique Leblanc led the ceremony, speaking of Henry's help to the parish, his business skill, and his love for the Southern cause. He did not mention suicide. Such things were not talked about openly, but everyone there understood the meaning of the carefully chosen words about God's mercy and the mysterious tests that challenge even the strongest souls. Armand Beauchamp left immediately after the funeral, explaining that urgent business required his return to Baton Rouge. Before leaving, he had a short talk with Tobias Greenleaf in which he stated that the plantation's management would stay under current arrangements until the estate was properly settled. What those current arrangements were exactly, he did not say clearly. Greenleaf understood that he was being told to accept Moses's continued power, at least for a short time, and this understanding did nothing to lower his growing anger. That evening, as the household was settling after the tiring day, Louisa was cleaning Henry's study, a job she had delayed as long as possible when she noticed something that stopped her cold. The hunting rifle that had killed Henry was back in its usual place above the desk. She was sure it had been taken as evidence by Sheriff Theot. She was even more sure that she had not seen anyone return it. She mentioned this to Moses, who told her that Armand had arranged for its return before leaving. This explanation was reasonable, yet something about the way Moses said it, or perhaps something about the way the rifle now hung, cleaned and oiled as if waiting to be used again, left Louisa very worried. One other detail from that day deserves mention. Late in the evening, after most of the household had gone to bed, Margaret was helping Celeste get ready for sleep when she noticed that her mistress was wearing a necklace Margaret had never seen before. It was a simple piece, a gold chain with a small locket, old-fashioned in style but well made. When Margaret asked about it, Celeste touched it lightly and said it had belonged to her grandmother. Margaret did not press the question, though she thought it strange that Celeste would choose to wear a new piece of jewelry on the day of her husband's funeral. She did not know, could not have known, that inside the locket was a small curl of dark hair and a folded paper containing 7 words written in Moses's distinct handwriting: "What we have begun cannot be undone." The weeks following Henry's death revealed cracks in Bellarev's social structure that had always existed beneath the surface, but had been held in check by the weight of established authority. With that authority removed, every relationship, every assumption, every unspoken deal came into question. The plantation did not collapse immediately. That would come later, but it began a slow change that worried everyone who understood what they were seeing. Moses continued to run Bellarev's work with a skill that even the Greenleaf brothers could not fault. The crops were tended, the mill ran for a profit, contracts with New Orleans agents were kept, and the estate's accounts showed continued income. On paper, nothing had changed. In real life, everything had changed. Moses no longer asked for approval for his decisions, no longer presented plans for someone else to sign off on. He simply acted, and the push of habit and the absence of clear other authority meant that people accepted his actions as real. Celeste remained hidden in the main house, appearing only for meals and necessary social duties. She met weekly with Father Leblanc, who visited to provide spiritual comfort during her mourning period. She received sympathy calls from neighboring plantation wives, though these visits became less frequent as rumors began to spread about her relationship with Moses. She wore black, followed the proper forms of being a widow, and gave no outward sign that she was anything other than a grieving wife waiting for the settlement of her husband's estate. But those who worked in the main house knew better. Margaret, whose position as Celeste's personal maid gave her close access to her mistress's private life, saw meetings between Celeste and Moses that happened more and more often and with less pretending to be proper. They met in the parlor, in Henry's former study, on the porch in the evening. They spoke in low voices, sometimes in French, which Moses had somehow learned despite having no formal schooling. They reviewed papers together, papers that Margaret saw briefly but could not read, papers covered with legal language and official seals. Louisa noticed changes in the household's work that suggested a shift in power. Celeste began making decisions about food supplies, about which servants should be assigned to which tasks, about matters that widows usually left to male relatives or overseers, but her decisions were never announced directly. They came through Moses, delivered with such plain confidence that people obeyed before questioning whether Celeste actually had the power to make such choices. The Greenleaf brothers realized that their position was being weakened, but they struggled to say exactly how or to point to a specific rule break they could challenge. Moses gave them no direct orders. That would have been an unforgivable break of racial rules. Instead, he simply told them of decisions that had been made, changes that would be done, arrangements that were now in place. When they complained, he sent them to Celeste, who confirmed that yes, these changes had her approval as mistress of the estate. When they questioned whether Celeste had the legal power to approve such changes, Moses pointed out that the estate was still being processed by the court, and that Armand Beauchamp had clearly stated that current arrangements should continue. By late July, Tobias Greenleaf had become convinced that Moses was controlling Celeste, possibly through threats, possibly through some other form of force he could not quite describe. He shared these doubts with his brother, with several neighboring overseers, and eventually with Sheriff Theot during a chance meeting in the main town. The sheriff listened politely, but pointed out that doubt was not proof, and unless Greenleaf could show actual wrongdoing, actual crime, there was nothing the law could do. The sheriff also reminded him with careful stress that making unproven claims about a white woman's honor could have severe legal results for the accuser. On August 3rd, something happened that brought these building tensions to a short, explosive fight. Moses had arranged the sale of 60 barrels of sugar to a New Orleans agent at a price much higher than Henry had negotiated for the previous year's crop. This was objectively good business, but Tobias Greenleaf chose to challenge the deal, arguing that Moses had no power to negotiate contracts and that the sale should be canceled. Moses calmly explained that he had negotiated the deal on Celeste's behalf with her full knowledge and approval, and that the contract had already been signed and the first payment received. Greenleaf, his frustration finally boiling over, made the mistake of clearly stating what many had been thinking. "You forget your place, Moses. You forget what you are." The confrontation took place in the mill office with half a dozen witnesses present. Moses's answer was quiet, measured, and absolutely crushing in its exactness. "My place is wherever Madame Beauchamp decides it to be. If you question my power, you question hers. If you question hers, you question the arrangements made by Mr. Armand before his departure. If you wish to challenge those arrangements, I suggest you travel to Baton Rouge and discuss the matter with him directly. Until you do so, I will continue to do the duties assigned to me by the mistress of this estate." It was a masterful piece of verbal skill, at the same time using multiple sources of power while offering no direct challenge to the racial rules that everyone understood governed their world. Greenleaf was trapped. He could not challenge Moses without appearing to challenge Celeste, could not challenge Celeste without appearing to go beyond his own power, could not appeal to arm, and without admitting that he had lost control of the plantation he was supposed to be supervising. That same evening, Tobias Greenleaf began writing a letter to Armand Beauchamp detailing his worries about Moses's growing influence and asking for clarification about the estate's management structure. He was still working on this letter when 2 days later he fell ill with signs that Dr. Fentress first identified as cholera, severe stomach pain along with vomiting, fever, and confusion. The illness came on suddenly, moved fast, and proved fatal within 48 hours. Tobias Greenleaf died on August 7th, 1852, 3 days after his fight with Moses. Cholera was not uncommon in Louisiana during summer months, particularly near the river. The same week Greenleaf died, 2 slaves from a neighboring plantation and a merchant in the town also died from similar signs. Dr. Fentress saw no reason to suspect foul play, though he noted in his records that the speed and severity of Greenleaf's decline was unusual, even for cholera. The body was buried quickly. The heat and the nature of the illness made this necessary, and Samuel Greenleaf found himself suddenly lifted to the position of sole overseer. Samuel lacked his brother's strong personality and his certainty about how things should be. He had relied on Tobias to make difficult decisions, to face problems directly, to keep the firm hand that everyone agreed was necessary in managing a large plantation. Without his brother, Samuel felt lost. When Moses approached him 3 days after the funeral with a plan to change the overseer's duties, supposedly to reduce Samuel's workload during this difficult period, Samuel agreed without fully thinking about what it meant. The new arrangement gave Samuel power over field work, while Moses kept control of business affairs, contracts, and money management. It was, Moses explained, simply a formal recognition of how things had been working anyway. What Samuel did not realize until too late was that he had just accepted a lower position. The person who controls money and contracts controls everything else. Moses now had official, or at least officially recognized, power over the plantation's most important operations, while Samuel was pushed down to supervising manual labor. It was a complete flip of the normal ladder, done so smoothly that Samuel only understood what had happened after the arrangement was already in place and working. Throughout these events, one person watched with increasingly sharp attention and growing alarm. Old Jack, who had cooked for the Beauchamp family for longer than most people on the plantation had been alive, had seen changes of power before. He had watched Henry's father die and Henry take control. He had seen hirings and firings, marriages and deaths, the constant small negotiations of power that occurred in any large household. But what he was seeing now was different. This was not slow change. This was a revolution done so slowly that most people did not recognize it as such. Jacques began paying attention to things that others missed. He noticed that Celeste no longer took her meals in the formal dining room, but instead ate in her private rooms, with Margaret bringing trays that Moses had personally picked from Jacques' kitchen. He saw that Margaret carried notes between Moses and Celeste several times each day, more communication than would seem necessary for simple household management. He saw that Louisa, who had once held total power over the household staff, now asked Moses before making decisions about staff or supplies. Most troubling of all, Jacques noticed that people were disappearing. Not literally disappearing, nothing so dramatic, but gradually being removed from positions where they might see or interfere with whatever was happening. 3 house servants had been moved to field work, a change that Moses explained as necessary due to lower household needs during mourning. 2 field workers known for their loyalty to the Greenleaf brothers had been sold to a neighboring plantation, a deal Moses described as good for money reasons. The butler who had served Henry for 15 years had been fired for being drunk, a charge that Louisa privately argued against but could not prove wrong. When Jacques mentioned these things to Louisa, she answered with something that surprised him. Fear, not anger, not shock, but real fear. "Do not speak of these things," she told him. "Do not even think them too loudly. There are changes coming that we cannot prevent, and the only safety is in not noticing them." On September 12, 1852, exactly 12 weeks after Henry Beauchamp's death, Moses appeared before Justice Budrow in the town seat, accompanied by Celeste and a lawyer from New Orleans named Edward Lafleur. The purpose of their visit was to present papers related to Henry's estate and to ask for the court's approval of certain arrangements. The papers included Henry's will, which had apparently been changed just 2 months before his death, a power of attorney giving Celeste power to manage the estate during the court process, and a freedom paper for Moses signed by Henry and dated April 15th, 1852. The will was simple enough. It left most of Henry's estate to Celeste with parts for his brother Armand and small gifts to several friends and distant relatives. Nothing in the will was unusual for a man without children. The power of attorney was also normal, giving Celeste wide power to do business on the estate's behalf during the legal period. The freedom paper was more tricky. It stated that Henry Beauchamp, in recognition of Moses's faithful service, great intelligence, and huge contributions to the success of Bellerive Plantation, hereby granted him freedom to start immediately. It was properly done with Henry's signature and the required witness signatures, but it had never been filed with the parish clerk, as Louisiana law required for freedom papers to be legally valid. Moses's lawyer argued that this was a small detail, that Henry had clearly intended to grant freedom and had signed the proper document, and the failure to file was a mistake that should not cancel Henry's clear wishes. Justice Budrow was not a simple man. He understood that he was looking at a situation that broke every norm of Louisiana society, that challenged assumptions about race and power that formed the foundation of the entire system. He also understood that he was being shown technically legal documents properly signed and stamped. He could reject them. He had the power to do so, but on what grounds? Because the situation made him uncomfortable. Because it seemed suspicious, because it broke unwritten rules about how things should be. After much thought, Justice Budrow accepted the documents for filing. He approved the freedom paper, granted Celeste the asked for power, and entered the will into the court process. In his private journal that evening, he wrote, "I have today done an act that may haunt me for the rest of my life. I have set in motion events that I suspect will not end well, but I have been shown legal documents that meet all requirements of law, and I have no basis on which to reject them. May God forgive me if I have been tricked, and may He protect those who may suffer from my decision." The news of Moses's freedom spread through the parish with amazing speed. Reactions ranged from disbelief to anger to a kind of fascinated horror. Neighboring planters began avoiding contact with Bellerive, treating it as if it were sick. The parish rich, who had once attended Henry's dinner parties, now refused invitations to visit. Father LeBlanc continued his visits to Celeste, but he made clear his deep worries about the situation and urged her repeatedly to think about the results of her choices. Samuel Greenleaf, upon hearing that Moses was now legally free, handed in his resignation effective immediately. He could not, he said, continue working under such circumstances. Moses accepted his resignation with perfect politeness and hired a new overseer within a week, a man named Amos Pritchett, who had worked on plantations in Mississippi and who seemed either unaware of or did not care about the strange arrangement at Bellerive. Throughout all of these developments, Moses kept the same calm face he had always shown. He did business, managed operations, and spoke with perfect manners to everyone. He made no big moves, issued no announcements, engaged in no behavior that could be called rude or bold. He simply continued doing what he had been doing, with the single but huge difference that he now did it as a free man. The question that everyone asked, that some asked openly and others only in whispers, was how this had happened. How had Moses convinced Henry to sign a freedom paper? How had he obtained Henry's changed will? How had he convinced Celeste to support his freedom and to work with him in managing the estate? The obvious answer, the answer most people assumed, was that Moses had somehow tricked or forced these things through threats, blackmail, or using Celeste's grief and weakness. But a few people, those who had watched most closely, suspected something more complex and more disturbing. They suspected that Moses had spent years, perhaps his entire life, preparing for this moment, that he had studied Henry so thoroughly that he understood exactly how to present himself as needed, that he had built Celeste's trust and possibly her affection through planned attention over months or years, that he had placed himself so smartly that when Henry died, he was the only person who could hold the estate together, making his freedom and power necessary rather than simply desired. And beneath these thoughts lay an even more troubling question that few people dared to say out loud. Had Henry Beauchamp really taken his own life, or had Moses planned his death so skillfully that it appeared to be suicide? The official investigation had been short, the evidence weak, the conclusion easy. Dr. Fentress' doubts had been noted but never seriously followed. The hunting rifle had been returned to its place above the desk with suspicious speed, and the one person who had directly challenged Moses's power, Tobias Greenleaf, had died suddenly just days after that challenge. These questions had no answers, only hints, and the hints were terrifying enough that most people preferred not to think about them too carefully. It was easier to accept the official explanations, to believe that Henry had given in to sadness, that Moses had simply been lucky, that Celeste was a confused widow making poor decisions under the influence of grief. But late at night, when people were alone with their thoughts, many of them wondered if Moses could change himself from slave to free man, from property to property owner in the space of 3 months. What else might he be capable of? And if he had been willing to do whatever it took to make this change, anything at all, how many people had already paid the price for his ambition? And how many more would pay before the story reached its end? The autumn of 1852 brought cooler weather but no drop in the tension surrounding Belarev. The plantation continued to run for a profit. The crops were gathered successfully, and Moses's management proved as good as it had been under Henry's ownership. But the social isolation of the estate grew deeper. Neighboring planters refused to do business with Belarev. Merchants in the town provided necessary supplies but did so with cold stiffness. The few visitors who came were strangers, agents from New Orleans, lawyers, businessmen who cared more about profit than rules. What do you think is unfolding at Belarev? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing secrets are still to come. The true nature of what was happening at Belarev became impossible to ignore on November 28, 1852, when Celeste Beauchamp and Moses appeared together at the parish clerk's office to file an application for a marriage license. The clerk, a man named Prosper Gautier, who had held his job for 23 years, initially assumed he had misunderstood their request. When Moses calmly repeated it, Goitier's hands began to shake. Moses pointed out with careful exactness that Louisiana law prohibited such marriages for enslaved persons or recently freed people of color. He was neither. His freedom papers had been filed in September. He had talked with lawyers in New Orleans and knew exactly which laws applied. After 3 hours of talk, Goitier found himself unable to find a specific legal reason to deny the application. The arrangements involved a Catholic priest who had been kicked out of the church named Father Mature Corbeau, removed from the church 5 years earlier for drinking too much. Corbeau agreed to do the wedding for a large fee. The ceremony took place on December 19, 1852, in Bellarève's parlor. The only witnesses were Louisa, Margaret, old Jacques, and the estate's lawyer. Father Corbeau stumbled through the prayers with breath that smelled of whiskey. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Celeste's hand shook as Moses placed a gold ring on her finger. By marrying Celeste, Moses gained legal control of her inheritance from Henry, which meant he now effectively owned Bellarève Plantation. The reaction from the parish rich was immediate and angry. A group of planters met to discuss action. Some argued for violence, others for legal steps. They settled on complete social and money isolation. No one would do business with Bellarève, but Moses had expected this response. His agent in New Orleans was Joachim Tessier, an ambitious trader who cared more about profit than rules. Tessier had connections to northern buyers, happy to purchase Louisiana sugar without worrying themselves with local scandals. The winter of 1852-1853 saw Bellarève working in complete isolation from its neighbors, but in growing connection to business networks beyond the parish. Celeste remained largely hidden in the main house, appearing in public only when necessary. Those who saw her described her as pale, thin, and emotionally closed off. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was flat and empty. Margaret, who continued serving as her personal maid, noticed that Celeste seemed relieved by her new situation. Moses made all decisions, bore all responsibility, faced all conflict. Celeste simply existed in a state of quiet acceptance. During the first months of 1853, several incidents suggested Moses was securing control by removing potential threats. In February, a field worker named Josiah claimed to have information about what really happened to Master Henry. Before he could share it, he disappeared. Moses reported him as a runaway. In March, old Jacques became ill with signs similar to those that had killed Tobias Greenleaf: severe stomach pain, fast decline, death within days. Samuel Greenleaf, now working in the town, began collecting words from people who had lived at Bellarève. He was convinced Moses had murdered Henry and possibly others. He talked to former servants and looked at parish records. On April 12, 1853, Samuel was found dead in his rented room. The official cause was sudden heart failure. He was 38 years old with no history of health problems. All of his notes and documents relating to Bellarève had vanished. Dr. Fentress noted in his private records that this was the fourth sudden death connected to Bellarève in less than a year. The pattern worried him deeply, but he had no medical proof of foul play. In any case, he set a meeting with Sheriff Thiot to discuss his worries. Before that meeting could happen, Moses visited him. They spoke for approximately 2 hours about medical matters. Then, Moses made a statement the doctor would never forget. "You understand that the world works according to natural laws. Sometimes people die for reasons that are perfectly natural but look suspicious to those who don't understand the complexity of human life. It would be unfortunate if such misunderstandings led a respected doctor to make accusations he could not prove. It was not clearly a threat, but the meaning was clear. Dr. Fentress canceled his meeting with the sheriff. He never spoke publicly about his doubts. In his private journal, he wrote, "I have today chosen fear over courage. I suspect I have allowed evil to continue unchecked because I lack the strength to face it." By summer 1853, Moses had achieved something impossible. He had gone from enslaved property to free man to legal owner of one of the most valuable plantations in the parish, all in 13 months. The cost measured in human lives remained unknown, but was suspected to be high. What do you think is unfolding at Belarev? The evidence suggests something darker than anyone dared speak aloud. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the most disturbing secrets are still to come. The winter of 1853-1854 brought growing pressure from many directions. In January, planters sent a request to the state lawmakers asking for tighter rules on giving freedom to slaves. The request didn't mention Moses by name, but everyone understood its target. The lawmakers talked, but in the end took no action. The first serious threat came in March 1854, when a New Orleans lawyer named Philippe Dufresne appeared claiming to represent Henry's distant relatives in France. They were challenging the truth of Henry's will, arguing he had been mentally unfit or forced when he changed it. The lawsuit aimed to overturn Moses's control by attacking Celeste's inheritance. Moses hired Chalner, a famous New Orleans lawyer. The legal battle proceeded through spring 1854. In April, a barn at Belarev caught fire in the middle of the night, destroying equipment and nearly spreading to the sugar mill. The fire had started in 3 separate locations at the same time, suggesting it was set on purpose. In May, someone shot at Moses as he rode along the plantation road. The shot missed and the shooter escaped. The most important development involved Margaret. Her position gave her close knowledge of everything happening in the main house. In June 1854, she approached Father Leblanc during a visit. She told him she believed Moses had murdered Henry and that she had proof, letters between Celeste and Moses that were written months before Henry's death. The letters showed a relationship that was close and secret, focused on shared plans for the future. Margaret had hidden these letters, intending to give them to the police. Father Leblanc was deeply disturbed. He wrote a letter to the bishop in New Orleans describing the situation and asking for advice. That letter was caught before it reached the bishop. On the night of June 23rd, Father Leblanc was found unconscious on the road between Belarev and his church. His horse was nearby, apparently having thrown its rider. The priest died 3 days later without waking up. The official explanation was a tragic accident. Margaret understood immediately what had happened. She took the letters and documents she had hidden and ran from Belarev in the middle of the night, heading toward New Orleans. She made it about 15 miles before she was found. The official account stated she had been caught by a patrol watching for runaways. During capture, she became upset and violent, suffering fatal injuries in the struggle. The documents she had been carrying were lost. No investigation was done. Celeste did not go to her burial. Moses sent flowers. In August, the lawsuit reached a critical phase. Interviews would take place in September, representing a big threat to Moses's position. The night before they were scheduled to begin, Philip Dufra was attacked in his hotel room. Two men beat him badly and stole all his legal papers. Dufra survived but was left with permanent injuries that ended his career. The attackers were never found. With Dufra unable to work and his papers destroyed, the lawsuit failed. In October 1854, the court threw out the challenge. Moses had won again, but the attack on Dufra marked a turning point. Everyone now understood that Moses was not simply lucky. He was willing to kill anyone who threatened his position. In November, Colonel Augustin Chevalier organized a meeting of planters to discuss the Bellarev situation. 23 men attended. They discussed options ranging from legal challenges to violence outside the law. A group was formed, 3 men who had planned to remove Moses in a way that could be called an accident. Moses learned about the meeting within 48 hours. He hired guards from New Orleans and turned Bellarev into a fort. He changed his daily habits, never traveled alone, never followed patterns people could guess. In December 1854, Lucien Broussard, one of the 3 men on the kill group, was found dead in his home, killed by a shotgun blast through a window. The investigation concluded it was a hunting accident, but the message was clear. Moses knew who was planning to kill him. On Christmas Eve, someone fired 6 shots at Moses as he returned to Bellarev. His guards returned fire. 2 people were killed. One of Moses's guards and one attacker identified as a man employed by Eshen Marchon. Marchon ran from the parish that night and was never seen in Louisiana again. Colonel Chevalier survived 3 more weeks before dying in January 1855, officially from lung sickness, though his signs looked like the stomach illness that had killed others who opposed Moses. By early 1855, Moses had removed or driven away everyone who had actively threatened him. He had proven he could not be moved, could not be killed, could not be defeated. But this victory came at a cost. Bellarev existed in complete social isolation. Moses had what he wanted: freedom, property, power. But he had it in a prison of his own making, surrounded by guards, living with a wife who barely spoke. By spring 1859, Moses had been the real master of Bellarev for nearly 7 years. The estate continued making profits, though isolation had taken its toll. Celeste's mental state had gotten much worse. She rarely left her rooms, spoke to people who weren't there, moved through the house like a ghost. Dr. Fentress could offer no answer beyond deep sadness. In May 1859, Louise died peacefully at age 72. She left behind a sealed letter addressed to Dr. Fentress. It contained her account of everything she had seen: the mysterious meetings, the suspicious deaths, the systematic removal of anyone who might challenge Moses. It was not legal proof, but it provided a full story of Moses's change through planned murder. Dr. Fentress read the letter and faced the decision that had haunted him for years. He chose to make a copy, seal the original with instructions to open it after his death, and leave it with his lawyer in New Orleans. If Moses killed him, at least the truth would eventually come out. But Moses did not kill him. By summer 1859, Moses seemed to have lost interest in removing threats. In August 1859, Moses announced he would free all enslaved people remaining on the plantation. Immediate and complete freedom for 73 people. The money results were huge. Belarev's entire workforce would disappear, making continued work impossible. But Moses proceeded anyway, filing freedom papers and making arrangements for those who wanted to leave. The decision confused observers. Moses had realized that continuing to run Belarev as a slave plantation made him part of the same system that had enslaved him. Freeing the people he owned was an attempt to break that cycle. To prove his change meant something beyond just swapping roles. Without enslaved labor, the fields could not be worked. The mill could not be run. By October 1859, Moses had essentially taken apart the money engine that had made Belarev valuable. Celeste's condition reached a crisis. In September, she stopped eating entirely. Dr. Fentress found her in deep physical and mental collapse, awake but unresponsive, existing in a state between life and death. Celeste died on October 17, 1859, 7 years and 4 months after Henry's death. The official cause was wasting disease and sadness. Moses did not go to the funeral, sending only flowers and a note. May she find the peace that she could not find in life. After Celeste's death, Moses was the only owner of Belarev. He had finally achieved total control, and he discovered it meant nothing to him. In November, he began selling off parts of Belarev, the mill, sections of land, equipment, animals, furniture. By December, only the main house and a few surrounding acres remained. On December 28, 1859, Moses called Dr. Fentress. The doctor found him in Henry's study, surrounded by documents, looking physically healthy but emotionally worn out. Moses poured brandy and began to speak. What he said, Dr. Fentress would later write in his journal. Moses did not confess to murder, but he spoke about the nature of power, about what it cost to get and keep. He spoke about slavery and freedom, about how both involved forms of control. He spoke about Celeste, about how their relationship had begun years before Henry's death, about how they had planned together to create chances allowing them both to escape. He did not say clearly they had killed Henry, but the hint was clear. He did not detail the other deaths, but he admitted that many obstacles were removed and necessary actions were taken. Most disturbing, he spoke about regret. Not moral regret for people killed, but practical regret that his methods had isolated him so completely that winning became the same as losing. He had achieved an impossible change, but created a life that satisfied him less than the one he had escaped. At the end, Moses asked, "If you could know with total certainty that a terrible unfairness would be corrected through terrible methods, would you accept that deal? Would you sacrifice others, many others, to achieve something that should never have been denied to you?" Dr. Fentress replied that he did not know. Moses smiled. "That is the correct answer. Anyone who answers confidently does not understand the question." That was the last time Dr. Fentress saw Moses Bosham. On January 12, 1860, Moses disappeared from Belarev. He took with him whatever wealth he had gathered from selling assets. He left no sign of where he was going. The house stood empty for weeks before neighbors noticed it had been left alone. The remaining property eventually went back to the state. No one ever saw Moses Bosham again. There were rumors, sightings in New Orleans, reports of a wealthy man of color in Mexico, but nothing confirmed. He disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. The story of Moses Bosham became a dark legend in Ascension Parish. People told different versions, emphasizing different parts. Some painted Moses as a brilliant planner who beat a cruel system. Others described him as a monster who murdered his way to power. The truth preserved in documents discovered decades later was more disturbing than any legend. Dr. Fentress' journal found after his death in 1008, 171 provided a full account based on direct observations. Lewis's sealed letter offered supporting details. Together they suggested Moses had been responsible for many deaths and that Celeste had helped him. But these documents also revealed something more complex. They showed Moses had been shaped by a system that treated human beings as property, that denied people choices based solely on race, that created conditions where the only path to freedom was through violence. The system had created Moses Bosch by denying him every fair path to the life he wanted. The legal questions surrounding Belarev were never fully solved. The deaths between 1852 and 1859 remained officially unsolved. No one faced legal results except Philippe Dufresne, who survived his attack but never worked as a lawyer again. In 1868, a northern journalist named Theodore Wexler investigated the Belarev story, but found most people refused to discuss it. He uncovered one interesting detail. In 1867, a man matching Moses's description had been seen in Veracruz, Mexico, running a successful merchant business. The man called himself Morris Beaumont and was accepted as white. Wexler traveled to Veracruz, but found no trace of him. The final piece emerged in 1903, when letters were given to the Louisiana Historical Society. Among lawyer Lafleur's papers was correspondence with a client who signed only as MB. The letters dated between 1860 and 1897 discussed money and legal matters. In one letter from 1889, MB wrote, "I have lived for many years now under a different name, free of the weight of who I was and what I did. I have been successful, respected, and I have harmed no one since leaving Louisiana. Yet I remain haunted by whether my change was worth the price others paid. I traded their lives for my freedom, and I cannot determine whether this was justice or crime, revolution or murder." The letter continued, "I know history will judge me harshly if my story is ever fully told. I accept this judgment even as I maintain I had no other path available. The system that enslaved me created the monster who destroyed that system from within. If I am guilty, then slavery itself stands guilty of creating me. Whether these letters were actually written by Moses cannot be proven, but they suggested he survived for at least 37 years after disappearing from Belarev, that he built a new life successfully, and that he spent those years wrestling with the moral meaning of his change. The story became a warning tale told differently depending on who was telling it. Some emphasized the danger of upsetting social order. Others pointed to it as proof of slavery's corrupting influence. Still, others dismissed it as exaggerated legend. The main house was torn down in 1887. The land was split up and sold. By 1900, nothing remained to mark where Belarev had stood. The cemetery where Henry and Celeste were buried was neglected for years before being fixed up in 1956. On Henry's gravestone, Henry Beauchamp 1807-1852, beloved husband and master of Belarev. On Celeste's, Celeste Beauchamp 1826-18 Enslaved-1859, may she rest in peace. No stone marked Moses's grave because no one knew where or when he died. Perhaps he lived many more years under a different name. Perhaps he died shortly after leaving Louisiana. Perhaps he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to recognize him. The story leaves us with uncomfortable questions. Was Moses Bossum a hero or a villain? Was his change freedom or crime? Were his methods justified by the impossibility of getting freedom through fair means, or do they damn him regardless? Did he prove individuals can overcome cruel systems, or did he simply show that cruelty creates monsters? These questions remain relevant because the conditions that created Moses Bossum, systems that deny people choices, that hand out power unfairly, that force individuals to choose between giving in and violence, have never fully disappeared. And wherever those dynamics exist, there will be individuals like Moses, brilliant and ruthless, who refuse to accept their assigned position and who are willing to pay any price, anyone's price, to change themselves. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Moses Bamp was right in his actions, or do his methods make him unforgivable? Could he have achieved freedom through other means, or did the system leave him no choice but violence? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter of Louisiana history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories exploring the shadows of America's past, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates history's uncomfortable truths. Remember, the past is never as simple as we want it to be, and understanding its complexity is the only way to avoid repeating its worst mistakes.